We have some really exciting news to cover today. There is new firmware for the S5 Mark II and for the S5 Mark IIX. We're going to go over the features and why I think these updates are really, really important. This is probably old news for some of you. I'm a little late in covering this, but I do think these features are worth talking about because they add some great functionality to both of these cameras. But before we get started, like this video, hit the subscribe button, and consider joining the channel. Channel members get exclusive access to Filmmaker Alchemy, behind-the-scenes lessons and insights on the business of video production. Learn how to turn your content into gold. I'll put a link in the description of this video where you can download this firmware because it is worth noting. If you just Google S5 Mark II firmware, you might get some older links that link you to older version of firmware. The new version of firmware for the S5 Mark II is 3.2 and the S5 Mark IIX is 2.2. I don't know why the firmware versions are so far off by a complete version. I know there's some functionality and there's probably a good reason why they did that, but there is different firmware depending on if you have the S5 Mark II versus the S5 Mark IIX, and it is different firmware numbers. Again, the S5 Mark II is 3.2 and the S5 Mark IIX is 2.2. And you should end up on a page that looks like this, and you can obviously see highlighted here in orange where you get the new firmware for the S5 Mark II, which is what I'm going to primarily focus on. That's the camera I have. I have updated my firmware. It went smoothly. It's very easy to do. There used to be older, clunkier ways to update the firmware, but now it's pretty straightforward. You download the zip file, you extract the bin. If you have a card that's been recently formatted, it's just a clean blank card. You go ahead and copy that bin file to the SD card, put it in the camera, and then you go to your wrench menu and you can find the firmware version. When you get to that page, there'll be an option to update the firmware if it's on the card that you have. So let's read through some of these features and we can talk about why I think they're so valuable. This is straight from the Panasonic website. There's a lot of blogs out there who have covered similar information. You can go ahead and read it there, but I wanted to get it straight from Panasonic right on their site so you can kind of know what to expect. Here is what the download page will look like if you haven't gotten it already. Again, you probably have if you're watching this video. So we're going to read through the features, which I'm sure you probably already know about, but I'm going to share some of my personal experience about why I think these are so valuable, and especially when it comes to things like hybrid zoom, because I just find that function so helpful on the S9, and I'm really glad that they decided to bring it to the S5 Mark II. So let's check it out here. The first feature is enhanced subject detection. So if you are a fan of the autofocus systems in these new Lumix cameras, which I think you probably are, coming from the historically archaic depth from defocus, there's people who argue whether it's better or worse than phase detect, but I think there's a lot to be said about the new hybrid phase detect autofocus that they're using, and getting more subject tracking is great. We have airplane tracking now, and airplane and train tracking for detection mode. So in addition to human and animal, we get these extra options. And then target parts has been added for car and motorcycle, so you can focus on which part of the vehicle you're looking at. We also have multiple frame marker displays being added. This is a feature that I think is criminally underused and not talked about enough. It's something I've been using for quite a while. If you know about how I like to approach production, usually, not all the time, but most of the time, I'm shooting open gate. And when you're shooting open gate, a big reason to do that, aside from anamorphic, which is not what I'm using it for, open gate gives you the full sensor readout in video, meaning you can shoot 16:9 just like you normally would, but you get the extra vertical resolution on the S5 Mark II. It's a 3x2 sensor, so it's not quite as tall as Micro Four Thirds, which is 4x3, but it still is extra vertical resolution, meaning you can easily or more easily take vertical video at the same time you're shooting horizontal video. I've done quite a few videos on my channel about how I do that, and one of the main things I use is these Lumix cameras shooting open gate, but having these frame markers displayed. Historically, I've always done it just using open gate and then having a frame marker for 16:9, but now you can add extra frame markers on top of the 16:9. You can do up to 3. So you can shoot in, with guides for 3 different aspect ratios that are all, kind of pre-programmed in. You can even make custom aspect ratios if you have some strange specific scenario, like a custom billboard or a certain display that has a strange aspect ratio. You can actually custom dial that in and have up to 3 frame markers on screen. This is so helpful. And the best part about it is that it's dynamic. So let's say you're shooting 16:9 and I have my 16:9 guides on, well, there'll just be like a green box around my whole frame. But the moment I switch to OpenGate, that green box changes, you know, visually what you're seeing. And it's all dynamic depending, it doesn't matter what frame rate you're shooting, doesn't matter what resolution you're shooting, it's all dynamically displayed and it changes. So you can switch through different modes and it makes no impact on the quality. It's not baked in, obviously. It's just a helpful display marker that is very, very nice. It's one of the huge advantages of Lumix is shooting OpenGate and this ability to view all your different aspect ratios in real time. Also very, very helpful. If you're not using those frame markers, definitely check it out. I think you'll love the feature. We've also got crop zoom. Now, I think something gets kind of lost in translation here because the way they described it, let me just read this and see if this makes any sense to you. The crop zoom feature allows extracting the central part of an image and enhancing the zoom effect without degrading the image quality. That kind of sounds like a bunch of nonsense, but basically what crop zoom is, it is different from hybrid zoom, which we're getting to. Crop zoom basically allows you to, on the digital display, crop in via, you know, zooming in on your frame. And even that's kind of a clunky way to describe it. The most useful version of crop zoom would be having a prime lens and then being able to zoom in that, like basically turning a prime into a zoom, because you can, you know, sort of digitally, even though it's not degrading the quality because it is using the sensor pixels to do this, zoom in. So it's not digital zoom. It is, you kind of have to use it to know how it works. It is hard to explain, but basically it would be the perfect scenario. Let's say you're on set, you're setting up an interview and you have like, I don't know, a 50 millimeter prime. Let's say you have a 50 millimeter prime and your framing is perfect, but like, ooh, you want a little bit, you want to like crop it just a little bit, but you don't want to zoom in. You don't want to reduce the image quality. Crop zoom will let you kind of scale those pixels, cropping into the pixels on the sensor to clean up the edges. So maybe that 50 millimeter prime becomes more like a 51, a 52, and you can kind of zoom in on the image without moving the camera. Let's say everything was set up, it was, you know, the lighting, everything was dialed in. You didn't want to go through all the effort of like moving stuff around. You could kind of just crop zoom in just a little bit to clean up the edges, to make the framing a little tighter if you wanted, if you're shooting something like a prime. It's not something I use all the time, but maybe it's useful in those, you know, specific scenarios where you just need to like tidy up the frame a little bit by zooming in slightly, even though you're not using a zoom lens. Hybrid zoom is the one that gets me more excited, and I'll read what it does and I'll explain it more in practice. The hybrid zoom offers enhanced convenience by seamlessly combining optical zoom with electronic zoom. So this is kind of a combo of that crop zoom with your physical zoom lens. And I think this is also one of those underrated, underappreciated features where I've made videos talking about it, and people who are coming from Sony or other systems don't quite understand how this works or why they would want it. Basically, on the S5 Mark II, it's a 6K sensor. So if you're shooting photos, they're 6,000 pixels wide by 4,000 pixels tall. The video version of that, the 6K video version, is very similar. It's like 59, 52 by some, 3,000, 4,000 odd. You're basically getting the whole sensor, whether you're taking photos or videos, which is quite impressive, I think. So, for people who would want like 8K out of something like the S5 Mark II, well, the sensor just doesn't have enough pixels to even do that. So you're getting the full quality sensor. Now, if you're shooting 4K, on the S5 Mark II, that sensor data is all like downsampled, and it's, you're still getting the full sensor, but you're not getting all the pixels necessarily. So what Lumix, Panasonic have come up with is a very clever feature that if you're shooting 4K and there's these extra pixels from the 6K source, as you're zooming, physically moving the lens, it is crop zooming along with you to increase your reach on the long end of the lens. And this is something that I think a lot of people, the more people who use it, the more people will talk about it because it is so helpful. A lot of us these days, I did a poll on the channel a little while back. Are you shooting 4K, 6K, 8K, yada? Most people these days, according to the poll and just from anecdotally talking to people, are shooting 4K. But if you have a 6K sensor or even an 8K sensor or whatever's coming in the future, if you have all that extra data that you can use to basically crop in on the long end of your lens, you can extend your reach and kind of get the best of both worlds. It's one of the reasons people like Micro Four Thirds, because it's a crop sensor. It gives you that extended reach at the telephoto side. So like a 100 millimeter lens becomes, optically similar to a 200mm lens in terms of reach, field of view, all that stuff. So hybrid zoom lets you do that with the twist of the lens. You don't have to touch the display. It's nothing digital. There's no buttons to hit. It is as native, as seamless as I could ever imagine. And I have tested this on the S9 and now on the S5 Mark II, and it works beautifully. It's, you know, I shoot with something like the 16-28 from Sigma, and I made a video talking about with this feature that essentially kind of becomes a 16-43. You could argue whether it's a 42 or a 43. I just say 43 because that's what the display shows you. And you will see that on the S5 Mark II as you zoom in. So like a 24-70, all of a sudden that 70 gets an extra multiplier on the long end. And this is happening in real time as you're zooming. So you don't even notice shifting pixels. You don't notice any, frame distortion. It's quite clever. It's quite impressive that you can take a true 16 on the wide end, and as you're zooming, it's also cropping as you go, and there's no buttons to push. It's very, very, very handy if you're shooting in a 4K mode. Now, if you're shooting 6K, you don't get that feature because, again, that is the full pixel of the sensor. So my 16-28 is a 16-28 in 6K open gate. However, I have noticed that you can use the stabilization, the high stabilization on the S5 Mark II to crop in as well. So that's another little hack, a workaround. If you need to crop in a little bit in that 6K mode, you can use the high stabilization. And there's probably some image quality degradation happening at that point. But with hybrid zoom, if you're shooting 4K, you can kind of get, you're kind of losing out on the full frame sensor, but in practice and use, I don't think it really makes that big of a difference. Obviously, a true optical lens that is the focal range is best, but in a pinch, as a feature, as an optional feature, again, none of these things are mandatory. You don't have to use them. They're just there if you find yourself in a situation where, hey, it'd be nice to have a little bit more reach out of my 24-70, out of my 16-28, whatever the lens is. People are excited about the Sigma 28-45, getting a little bit more reach out of that. So hybrid zoom, very, very powerful if you know how to use it. And trust me, I think once you start using it, if you're shooting 4K, I think you're going to really like it. We also get some compatible to recording format in the MP4 Lite mode. So the option for the low bitrate video format, MP4 Lite, can now be selected. This is nice for those people who need the lightweight files. It's not something I'm doing all that often, but there's plenty of people out there shooting live events, shooting weddings, shooting ceremonies, whatever it is. And they just want lighter weight files that aren't, terabytes of data. It's funny how we've gotten things like ProRes and these high-end, ultra megabit, 400 megabit, 800 megabit, whatever crazy file sizes there are nowadays on all these different cameras. And yet people still have the need and the desire for lightweight, simple, easy to share, easy to transfer video codecs. And I should say that in addition to this, let's not forget that the S5 Mark II got an older firmware update that gave us the ability to record proxies, which is another great option. Let's say you're shooting your full res, your high bitrate stuff. You can also record proxies on the S5 Mark II. And let's not forget, we also have the functionality to upload to Frame.io with camera to cloud. Another huge feature that I have not taken full advantage of, and I'm trying to get it set up so that I can actually start incorporating that into some of my productions where it is day of, or it's more of like a live style event, just that seamless transfer of those proxies to the cloud so an editor can be working while the shoot's happening. Those types of optimizations and efficiency savings are so, so powerful. And this isn't even the new firmware. This is old firmware, like almost a year ago. So, I think it goes to say that Lumix, Panasonic does a great job supporting these cameras. And this could be the last firmware update for the S5 Mark II. It's getting kind of older now. It's not old, it's not outdated, but it is definitely gotten a lot of features that have been added since the launch. And we're going to talk about features that have been removed. So don't worry, I am going to cover that. But we've gotten a lot of stuff added over all the firmware iterations that have come out over the last year or so. And it is quite nice to see that level of support. I would hope that there's at least one more good firmware update for the S5 Mark II. I think that would be the crown jewel, the icing on the cake, the final little, little extra, the final salt on the dish, if you will. If we get one more firmware update out of the S5 Mark II before it's kind of past support and we've moved on to the newer stuff. But when you look at things like the S9 having such great features like crop zoom, hybrid zoom, etc., I'm nice that they went back and added that to the S5 Mark II. This truly makes the S5 Mark II, like I've already said, that it's probably the most valuable bang for the buck camera out there. And this just even adds more power and functionality to it. With the sixth bullet point here, we've got picture size extra small option has been added. The option to select the smaller file size image is now available. So I believe this is for JPEGs where you have small, medium, large. You now have extra small if you really want super tiny, maybe preview JPEGs. Let's say you're shooting RAW, but you want RAW and JPEG and you want super tiny JPEGs. I believe you can do that now. Although it's not something I do all that often, it's a nice feature to have. Again, to keep those file sizes down, keep it lightweight for the people that want that, for the people who need it. Other people might want the biggest JPEGs and they might edit those. Both are good solutions. Number 7, it's compatible with the new features on the Lumix smartphone app, the Lumix Lab. So we've got remote shooting is now available on Lumix Lab. We've got shutter remote control is now available on Lumix Lab, and transferring images select on the camera is now available on the Lumix Lab. This is where it's getting, I don't know, I wish these apps were further optimized. For the longest time, Lumix, I think back in the GH4 is when I started using it, the Lumix Sync app. So you can kind of remote view, remote shoot, you can sync it to an iPad or a smartphone. And it's always worked. I've mixed results where it'll work and then it'll stop working and you got to reconnect to the Wi-Fi and it'll forget the network, or you got to, turn it off, turn it back on, or reset the password. There's so much clunkiness associated with this Wi-Fi transfer sharing. And I can't say I've had better success with the Lumix Lab app. It's almost like they started over and they like are basically start from scratch on a new app. And now they're adding all the features from Lumix Sync to the Lumix Lab. Maybe there's a good reason why they did that. I know the primary function of the Lumix Lab was kind of quick JPEG development, the real-time LUT kind of stuff. But I've never had it, I've never really had a strong need for it, certainly to the point that I'd be willing to deal with the headache and the hurdles, because I'm the type of person, even if it fails 5% of the time, this is why I have such an issue with the cameras that overheat. Even if it's good 95% of the time, that 5% is always in the back of my brain. It's always the part that strikes when you're on set, when you're on production, you're trying to do something, and that 5% failure rate, or even the 1% failure rate, is just so unreliable. I can't factor that into my production because that's always when it comes up. I'll do all the testing. It'll work seamlessly. You can say the same thing about live streaming. It'll work great, it's seamless, until it's not, and then it's super frustrating, and you need those solutions that are bulletproof. And I can't say the Lumix apps have been bulletproof, at least for me. Maybe they're better, maybe with further updates, but there's a lot of factors at play. What version iPhone are you using? What iPad model are you using? What's the distance? Honestly, the best way I've found, like the most functionality I've ever gotten out of those apps is just the remote feed. Basically send a video signal so someone else can monitor. And I just don't think the Wi-Fi from the camera is capable of doing that at any distance, at any reliable interval. It's always been a sticking point and a frustration. However, I will probably make a video about a better solution, which you may have heard of, is the Hollyland M1 enhanced 5-inch monitor. Not the 7-inch, the 5-inch monitor has wireless streaming built right into it. There's no extra dongles. It's just a monitor that can stream from it, and it works beautifully. I'm going to do a whole video about it because I think it's worth covering. But if you're looking for some kind of wireless viewing, monitor experience for a client or just a director, a producer, whoever needs to see the feed, check out those Hollyland M1 enhanced monitors, the 5-inch. They're great. They're awesome. And if you're already using a monitor anyway, it makes no difference because it's basically the same size. It really, really works, like impressively so. Days of production streaming to a monitor, a remote box, as well as streaming to iPads, to iPhones. It works remarkably well. I can't speak highly enough of that. That's why I'm going to do a whole separate video on it. Number 8, feature changes due to security enhancements. Here's where this update gets a little controversial and may or may not be worth you updating. Sorry, it's taking me so long to get to it. But when directly connecting the camera and smartphone via Wi-Fi, the connection has been changed to always require password authentication. Here's where we get into that kind of like like the tedious nature of connecting and disconnecting and just connection issues in general. Anytime you're troubleshooting Wi-Fi and IP, it's always a headache and something I really try and avoid, but there's people who need it. So it is important. So just keep that in mind. You're going to always require password authentication now. And we've got some, the TKIP encryption method is no longer supported when connecting to Wi-Fi via an access point, and the no encryption option in network authentication is no longer supported when connecting to Wi-Fi via an access point, and the image transfer feature to PC via Wi-Fi has been removed only on the European models. So this is where, it's very niche, very fringe scenarios. Maybe you have some specific IP streaming wireless connection going on with your camera. This maybe will remove that feature. So buyer beware, be careful. I'm pretty sure downgrading your firmware is a whole lot harder than upgrading your firmware. I've never had to look into it, thank goodness. There may be a way to do that. I don't know, but just be careful. There's some stuff that's been removed and it's kind of controversial. There's some people talking about it. Why I bought a camera with these features and now they're being taken away. I don't know how many of these people it's actually affecting or if it's more on the principle that they're upset. This seems to be like less than 1% of the user base would probably be using these features specifically, but let me know if this affects you directly. Leave a comment and explain kind of how and why this would be so detrimental. It sounds like they're doing it for some kind of security reason. I don't know if there's an exploit or something going on with that functionality that opens up the camera. But let me know if it's something you need or if it's kind of like a moot point and no one's even using the feature. So if they remove it, who cares? We also get other improvements for operational stability. That's kind of almost on every one of these firmware updates. Further enhancements, further improvements, little bug fixes that aren't worth really calling out and mentioning as much as these features. So what gets me most excited is the hybrid zoom finally on the S5 Mark II. I was using the S9 every once in a while when I needed that feature, the hybrid zoom, but now I have it on the S5 Mark II, which is great. And they get the frame markers. I think that's hugely valuable. Although there are some workarounds. You can basically, if you use a rule of thirds grid, that middle third is pretty close to vertical if you're shooting open gate. So if you have a camera that doesn't support the frame outline markers, there are some other guides that aren't as exact or as precise that get you close. So you can always make it work, and that's how I've been doing it. I'll have my 16:9 guide on there using the frame marker in the Lumix camera, and then I'll have a rule of thirds grid on there as my vertical center slice to kind of get a rough estimate what's going to be in that vertical safe zone. So there's some tricks you can do, but it's nice to have it built right in. Again, dynamic, it's native, it's going to scale proportionally depending on what you're shooting. So you can switch between 4K 16:9 or 6K open gate, and that vertical framing will change appropriately using those frame markers. Huge update. Very nice to see. In addition to all the other wonderful updates we've gotten from Lumix on the S5 Mark II, I'm glad they believe in this camera so much. I'm glad that it's as popular as it is because it solves all those problems that Lumix was notorious for. Oh, Lumix is only micro four thirds. There's no full frame. Well, the S5 is full frame. Oh, Lumix has terrible autofocus. Well, the S5 Mark II has phase detect autofocus. All the problems with Lumix have been resolved. The main pain points, the main points of criticism, not being full frame, not having good autofocus, that was resolved, and now we get incredible support via firmware. Yes, there's things you can nitpick. Oh, it can't do 4K 60 uncropped. Okay, fair enough. There's minor points of criticism. If you need 4K 120 full frame, there's other cameras that will do that. It's not the S5 Mark II, but if you need a general purpose, really affordable, I think these used now they're like so, I don't want to say dirt cheap because anything over $1,000 it's still expensive. It does take a toll on people's budgets. But man, when I think back to what cameras used to cost and what they cost now, and looking at something like an S5 Mark II for like $1,500, maybe even cheaper used, maybe you find a good deal. Lumix has been constantly rolling out these promotions where you buy an S9, you get some free lenses, or you buy an S5 Mark II, you get some free lenses. It's huge value here for something that can do almost everything. I will say watch out for the moire. That does happen from time to time on those really tight patterns. I've had suits that have been fine, but every once in a while there's a sheen material that you'll get that moire effect, and it's, you can work around it. There's always a solution, but be on the lookout. It does creep up from time to time. I'd say less than 1% of the time. You just got to know kind of what to look for. And also your depth of field can affect that as well. So some small nitpicks of criticism on the S5 Mark II, but for me, the value is immense. It's totally there. It's one of my favorite cameras I've ever used. I love shooting with it. Never overheats. Can't say enough good stuff. And I'm glad to see further support with these great features. So I'm not picking and choosing between like, well, I like the S5 Mark II, but the S9 has these other good features that I need. It's always best to keep them all together. And guess what? The more these features get, I talked about this in another video, but the more these features get implemented across multiple camera models, the more popular they will become, because it will become the new ubiquitous feature, like setting a custom white balance or having face detect autofocus. There's just things that kind of demand repetitive use across devices. It's really unfortunate when one camera has one particular use feature, but it's only on that one camera, so no one ever knows about it, no one ever talks about it, and then no one ever uses it because no one knows about it. The more these features can become across the entire ecosystem on every new camera. Imagine what you could do with hybrid zoom on something with higher resolution than the S5 Mark II. You can, that further crop, the further enhancement, the zooming in more on more pixels. If you had a 50 megapixel sensor or a 60 megapixel sensor, right? The kind of possibilities are limitless when it comes to resolution and how you're dynamically framing it. If it's oversampled and downsampled to 4K, or if you're able to in real time crop into those pixels, that hybrid zoom, it's a game changer, because again, no buttons, no dials. It just works with the lens. You just zoom the lens like you normally would, and you're getting that extra reach. Yes, it's changing the characteristics of the sensor and the file a little bit, but in the grand scheme of things, if you need it and you want that functionality, it's really nice to have, to be able to turn it on and get that extra reach out of something that may otherwise be kind of limited, because it seems to be the trend to make these lenses smaller, more compact, more lightweight, but at the expense of having diminished focal ranges, where we're not having, like a 16 to 35 is obviously more flexible than a 16 to 28. But the 16 to 28 is cheaper, lighter, and also exists. I think L-mount doesn't have a 16 to 35 that's actually a f2.8. There is an f4 16 to 35, which is kind of old now and probably due for a refresh, if my memory serves correct. But then there's things like the 16 to 28 that's, cheaper, lighter, faster option as well. So getting further functionality of whatever lens it is a no-brainer, because it doesn't matter on the lens. You can use any lens with hybrid zoom. If it is a zoom lens, try it out in 4K. It doesn't work in 6K open gate. In 4K mode, and I think you'll see quickly how exciting a feature like that is, because it just unlocks so much further possibility. And you didn't have to buy a new lens. You didn't have to pay any more money. Lumix, Panasonic gave it to you for free via this firmware update. I think unless you need some of those things that they're taking away, what they're adding is quite valuable.